My name is Anders Gustafsson. I made this game back in 2006 and released it as freeware on the internet. When writing these comments, I've made the assumption that you're either a fan of the genre who wants to know how the sausage is made, or somebody who makes, or intends to make, adventure games of your own. That's chiefly who I wrote these comments for. If you feel left out by these two categories, don't worry, I'm sure there's something in here for you too. Cheers. Gateway started out as the tutorial for another game called Shipwrecked. Shipwrecked was about a young married couple who went sailing in order to save their disintegrating marriage. Throughout the game the couple would be beset by dangers, like storms and equipment failure, forcing them to work together. I had been working on it for months before I realized that the only part I actually liked was the tutorial. It took place in this abstract minimalist void, and was far more intriguing than the story of the young couple. The tutorial consisted of 3 rooms that taught the player basic mechanics. The first room, which you're looking at right now, was about basic navigation since the engine couldn't pathfind at that point. Instead, the player had to manually steer the little character past some knee-high obstacles. It wasn't a very gripping way to start a game, and since pathfinding has been added to the engine, the obstacles have been removed. Starting the game in an empty moody room was a better way to let the player familiarize themselves with the controls without other distractions. I just resigned from my day job in Copenhagen and had saved some money to work on my own projects for a while. In order to put a bit more pressure on myself, I decided to enter a competition hosted by a website called JS Games. Aside from some sweet prizes, it provided me with the thing I needed the most, a screamingly tight deadline. With less than 2 weeks to go, I put an axe to everything but the tutorial rooms and started working on an entirely new game, which would consist of a sequence of small self-contained puzzles in the same style as the tutorial. I was trying to keep a pace of 1 puzzle per day, which I didn't quite achieve, but at least I managed to enter the competition on time. The game received an honorary mention from the judges and ended up snagging the audience award, which really spurred me on to continue making games. Competitions, festivals and game jams are all awesome ways to add a little external pressure if you need an extra push. At that time, with less than 2 weeks to go, the game received an honorary mention from the judges and ended up... The second room of the tutorial focused on teaching the basics of inventory management by having the player pick up the set of stairs and place it by the ledge. Although the puzzle got the job done, the premise of the puzzle is admittedly fairly silly. Who walks around with a set of stairs in their pockets? Would be used on a television that would then show a program about sailboats. The program would then trigger memories in the player character's mind, kicking off the story about the young couple. Once I decided to scrap everything except the tutorial, the television no longer made any sense here, and was replaced by a remote control door. I liked the forlorn television though, and decided to use it in a later puzzle. I decided to scrap everything except... The player prove he or she has understood the basics of inventory interaction, and shows the player that it's possible to combine 2 inventory objects, which is something some adventure games doesn't allow. I don't use inventory combinations a lot in Gateway, but it's nice to have the option. Puzzle was originally combined with another, but for the remastered edition of the game I decided to split them into 2 parts. I hadn't really considered color blindness much at all. But once I released this game, I immediately started getting emails from colorblind players regarding this puzzle. When I started researching, I found out that color blindness affects a lot more people than I was aware of, 1 in 8 men and 1 in 200 women. I remember receiving an email from a colorblind player, who described the steps he had to take in order to solve this puzzle. It was painful to read. He basically had to take a screen grab every time he stepped on a floor plate, import it into Photoshop and then, using the color picker's hexadecimal value, compare that value with the value of the equivalent shape above the door. That would let him figure out what color should go where. It must have taken him a depressingly long time. After that, I've refrained from using color-based puzzles whenever possible, or at least, offer some kind of alternative solution. It also made me add accessibility options to make my games more enjoyable for colorblind or deaf people, something I think more games should offer. Prior to designing this room, I hadn't really considered colorblindness much at all. But once I released game, I had started a lot of adventure game projects that I never managed to finish. The reason for that was that the ideas were far too ambitious in relation to what I could actually pull off. It's a common story among budding game designers. I wanted the games to have immersive atmosphere, great story, fetching visuals, engaging puzzles, and be technically proficient. But once I sat down to make the game, one or more of these things would always come up short, which led to me becoming frustrated and dismayed, eventually giving up. So with Gateway, I decided to just focus on the bare essentials. The graphics would be kept as simple and readable as possible. Each room would only contain a small, self-contained puzzle. Nothing else. This puzzle has been redesigned for the remastered edition. The original version involved too much guesswork on the player's behalf. Most players ended up solving it by accident or brute force. For the remastered edition, I decided to simplify the puzzle and give it a bit more clarity. This puzzle has been redesigned for the remastered. Decided on the premise of this puzzle, that another character writes the answer to the puzzle backwards, I started listing words consisting of letters that would look like numbers if mirrored. Once I came up with Peeper, which reads as 739,339 in a mirror, I knew I had the winner. This room was also the first indicator of what would end up being something of a voyeuristic theme throughout the series. It also made the game world feel larger, hinting that there's places to visit in the darkness beyond. I started to grasp that puzzle design becomes a lot easier if you have a clear concept to base the puzzle on. In this case, the puzzle is based on the concept of teleportation, which should become clear once the player starts messing with it. Once the player has grasped the concept, he or she is much more likely to stick through a hard puzzle because they've at least grasped the fundamental mechanism. It gives them a framework to test subsequent theories on. Solve puzzles in a cycle that consists of 4 stages. First, the player tries to identify the end goal of the puzzle. In Gateway, that's always to get through the next door. Then they try to identify what's in their way. Is the door locked? Is the door unreachable? Then they try to identify what they have to work with and start forming theories on how these components are related. Then the theory is tested. If the theory is correct, the puzzle is solved and the player can proceed. But if it's incorrect, it's very important to give some kind of feedback, so the player can start the cycle again with a stronger inkling. If no feedback is given, the player can be left testing faulty theories over and over, which quickly becomes frustrating. Striking the right balance in your feedback is crucial. If too much or too obvious feedback is given, the puzzle starts to feel condescending and won't be satisfying to solve. If you're too vague, you risk frustrating or confuse the player even more. Your best bet out of this dilemma is early and frequent play testing. I tried to do 1 room per day, but that ambition that was thwarted by this room. I'd get up in the morning and decide what mechanism I wanted to base today's puzzle on. Colors? Sequential order? Teleportation? And then I'd spend the rest of the day implementing and tweaking. Each step in the staircase to evaluate if they had a neighbor that the player could reach, and then allow the player to ascend the staircase even if only half the steps were in the right place. This evaluator proved too advanced for me to code at the time, and after 2 days of failures I almost ditched the entire puzzle. On the 3rd day I decided to give it one last try, starting from scratch with a much simpler implementation. The staircase would only be walkable if all the pearls were in the right place. Otherwise the player wouldn't be able to walk on the staircase at all. This simple implementation proved a breeze to implement and allowed me to finish the puzzle in an hour. There's usually an easier way to do something, but sometimes you need a night's rest to realize it. Or a long walk. game I tried to do one room per day, but that ambition that was thwarted by on the third day I decided to give it one last try, starting from scratch with a much simpler implement. This is where the floor and television from the third tutorial room eventually ended up. Originally, the player had to connect the television to an electrical outlet through a bunch of cords, but for the remastered edition of the game, I decided to split that into two separate puzzles. The core of the Gateway games is all about minimalism and clarity, and two puzzles in the same room muddled the experience. You see in the television was borrowed from another failed adventure game. It was about a small town where people had starting to mysteriously fall asleep one by one. I had started drawing all these backgrounds for interiors and exteriors of the town, but the game never really gelled. Later on I ended up reworking its basic concept into what ended up being a game called The Dream Machine that you should totally check out. Available on Steam. This was another puzzle that ended up frustrating a lot of people. It leaned heavily on color perception and originally had lights that blinked a lot faster than what you see today. As it turns out, a lot of people had problems perceiving the number of blinks, and subsequently had an unfairly hard time solving the puzzle. I wanted this room to be hard since it's the last puzzle in the game, but there's a big difference between a puzzle that is tough but fair, and one that's just a frustrating slog. For the remastered edition, the blinks have been slowed down. I hope you like this short little game. I regard it as my first fledgling step into the fascinating world of puzzle and game design. I learned a lot doing it and it will always hold a special place in my heart. Cheers.